Some dreams take years to save for, and Noah Briggs had spent every one of those years sacrificing for his 3 children. After losing his wife to cancer and raising his kids alone, he finally scraped together $13,000 to buy a rundown house that would give them something he never had growing up, a real home. The paint was peeling and the floors creaked, but when his youngest daughter ran through the empty rooms shouting with joy, Noah knew every missed meal and double shift had been worth it. He stood in the doorway, watching his children discover their new world, feeling like he'd finally done something right as a father. But old wiring doesn't care about dreams, and within minutes of moving in, sparks turned into flames. The house that was supposed to be their fresh start became a death trap, with his 3 children trapped inside and screaming for help. What happens when a father's greatest triumph becomes his worst nightmare in the span of 3 minutes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years earlier, Noah Briggs had been a different man. He'd worn pressed shirts to his management job at the regional distribution center, came home to a wife who greeted him with coffee and a smile, and helped his children with homework at a kitchen table that always smelled like Sarah's homemade bread. The wedding ring he now wore on a chain around his neck had once circled his finger, a daily reminder of promises kept and a future planned together. Cancer changed everything in 18 months. Sarah fought with the grace she'd brought to everything else in life, never complaining even when the treatments left her weak and hollow-eyed. She'd insisted on maintaining routines, packed lunches for the kids, family dinners when she could manage them, bedtime stories read in a voice that grew progressively softer. Noah had taken leave from work, burned through their savings on medical bills, and watched the woman he'd loved since high school fade away one breath at a time. The day she died, 13-year-old Lily had held 7-year-old Emma, while 10-year-old Marcus stood silent in the hospital hallway, too young to process grief, but old enough to understand finality. Noah had made promises at Sarah's bedside, promises about keeping the family together, about being the father their children deserved, about honoring the love she'd poured into their lives by continuing to pour it into theirs. Keeping those promises had been harder than any grief counselor could have prepared him for. The management position disappeared during his extended leave, replaced by warehouse work that paid less but offered the flexibility of multiple shifts. Noah learned to braid Emma's hair, watching YouTube videos at midnight after his second job. He discovered that Marcus inherited his mother's stubborn streak along with her green eyes, often refusing help with math homework even when tears of frustration rolled down his cheeks. Lily became a second mother to her siblings, organizing their school clothes and making sure they ate breakfast, her childhood sacrificed to necessity in ways that broke Noah's heart daily. Their apartment on Maple Street had thin walls and thinner bank accounts. Noah worked the day shift at the warehouse, then stocked shelves at the grocery store until closing, coming home to help with homework and tuck his children into beds that barely fit in rooms meant for one. He'd sit in the living room afterward, surrounded by bills and the quiet sounds of a family trying to heal, planning every dollar with the precision of a military campaign. $13,000. That's what 3 years of double shifts, skipped meals, and patched clothing had yielded. $13,000 in a savings account that represented every sacrifice, every missed school play when work demanded overtime, every generic brand grocery purchase, and every maybe next month when the kids asked for things their friends had. But $13,000 could buy a house in Millbrook County where property values reflected the area's economic struggles and old houses waited for families who could love them despite their flaws. Noah had driven past the house on Elm Street dozens of times during his evening commute, watching the for sale sign grow weathered and sun-faded. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 1970s, and a front porch that sagged like an old man's shoulders. The realtor, A kind woman named Mrs. Peterson, who'd known Sarah from church, had been honest about the house's problems. The roof needed work within 5 years. The plumbing made concerning sounds. The electrical system dated back to when the house was built in 1962, and while it passed inspection, she'd recommended having it upgraded as soon as possible. The basement sometimes took on water during heavy rains. But, she'd said, watching Noah's face fall as the list of necessary repairs grew longer, it has good bones. The foundation is solid, the frame is sound, and there's something about a house that wants to be loved again. Noah had walked through the empty rooms with his children on a Saturday morning in early May, sunlight streaming through windows that needed new screens and highlighting dust motes that danced like possibilities. Emma had run from room to room, her footsteps echoing on hardwood floors that creaked but held firm. Marcus had claimed the smaller bedroom immediately, already planning where his model airplanes would sit on the built-in shelves. Lily had stood in what would become the girls' room, touching the window frame and looking out at the backyard where a tire swing hung from an old oak tree. "We could have a garden," she'd said quietly, and Noah had heard Sarah in her voice, the same tone his wife had used when dreaming aloud about their future. The paperwork had taken weeks to process, each day stretching longer as Noah worried that someone else might swoop in with a better offer or that the seller might change their mind. He'd continued working both jobs, adding weekend shifts when available, protecting that savings account balance like a father protects his sleeping children. The day the call came from Mrs. Peterson confirming the sale, Noah had been stocking canned goods in aisle 7 of Henderson's Market. He'd stepped into the storage room to take the call, listening to her cheerful voice explain that the house was theirs, the closing was scheduled for Friday, and they could have the keys by the weekend. Noah had hung up the phone and cried for the first time since Sarah's funeral. That Friday afternoon, he'd signed papers that made him responsible for property taxes, homeowners insurance, and a mortgage that would stretch his paycheck thin but not break it. The seller, an elderly man whose wife had passed away the year before, had shaken Noah's hand and wished him well, saying he was glad to see a young family moving in. "She'll be good to you if you're good to her," the old man had said, patting the kitchen door frame like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. The moving truck, really just Noah's borrowed pickup truck, making multiple trips, had arrived on Saturday morning. Mrs. Chen from the apartment complex had helped load their furniture, such as it was. Beds that the kids had outgrown but couldn't afford to replace, a kitchen table with uneven legs, a couch that sagged in the middle but still held a family for movie nights. Everything they owned fit into 6 trips, with the most valuable possessions being photograph albums and Sarah's recipe box. Neighbors on Elm Street had gathered to watch the new family arrive. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door had brought over fresh cookies and a phone number in case you need anything. The Hendersons from across the street had introduced themselves and mentioned that they'd be happy to recommend a good electrician when Noah was ready to tackle the wiring. Old Mr. Kowalski from 2 houses down had simply nodded from his porch, but Noah caught him later that evening, checking that the family's front door was properly locked. Small towns had rhythms that apartment complexes couldn't replicate. Children rode bicycles in streets where everyone knew their names. Neighbors borrowed lawnmowers and returned them with full gas tanks. Front porches served as community meeting places where adults discussed weather and children, and where problems were shared with people who might actually be able to help solve them. Noah had stood in his new living room that first evening, surrounded by boxes and the chaos of relocation, listening to his children's voices echo through rooms that belonged to them. Emma had been singing to herself in what was now officially her room, a made-up song about princesses who lived in castles with creaky floors. Marcus had been arranging his model airplane collection on the bedroom shelves, making airplane sounds as he positioned each one for optimal flying formations. Lily had been in the kitchen, unpacking dishes and organizing them in cabinets with the methodical care she'd inherited from her mother. For the first time in 3 years, Noah had felt something that might eventually grow into contentment. Not happiness that seemed too much to expect, but a quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, he'd managed to give his children something that mattered. A place where Emma could sing without neighbors complaining about noise. A place where Marcus could spread out his homework on a kitchen table that didn't wobble. A place where Lily could stop being a second parent and start being a 13-year-old again. The electrical problems had announced themselves almost immediately. Lights flickered when the refrigerator kicked on. The outlet in the bathroom sparked occasionally when hairdryers were used. The circuit breaker tripped whenever too many appliances ran simultaneously. Noah had made mental notes about calling an electrician after the first paycheck from his new address was deposited, after he'd figured out the true cost of homeownership, after he'd established a buffer in the checking account for unexpected expenses. But 3 years of living paycheck to paycheck had taught him to prioritize immediate needs over potential problems. The lights worked, even if they flickered. The outlets functioned, even if they occasionally protested. The house was warm and dry and theirs, and that felt like enough progress for now. On the morning that would change everything, Noah had awakened before dawn, as he had every day for 3 years, his internal clock calibrated to maximize productivity. He'd showered quietly, made coffee in a kitchen that was still foreign but beginning to feel familiar, and stepped onto a front porch that now welcomed him home, instead of just sheltering him temporarily. The morning air had carried the scent of Mrs. Rodriguez's rose garden and the distant sounds of a community awakening to another day. Noah had stood there for a few minutes, coffee cup warming his hands, watching the sun rise over a neighborhood where his children would grow up with space to breathe and dreams to chase. He'd had no way of knowing that old wiring and new dreams were about to collide in the span of 3 minutes, turning the American dream into an American nightmare with the efficiency of a house fire and the permanence of trauma. He'd had no way of knowing that sometimes the thing you've worked hardest for becomes the thing that threatens everything you love most. All he'd known was that for the first time since Sarah's death, he'd felt like he might actually be winning the battle to give his children a better life. That morning, standing on his own front porch and watching his neighbors begin their days, Noah Briggs had felt like the kind of father Sarah would have been proud of. By evening, he'd discover that pride and desperation were separated by the thickness of electrical wire insulation and the speed of spreading flames. The smoke-damaged family photo would later be found wedged behind the dresser in what had been Emma's room, its edges charred but the faces still visible. Noah, Sarah, and 3 younger versions of his children on a beach vacation from what felt like another lifetime. That photo, rescued by a firefighter who noticed it flutter down from a collapsing ceiling beam, would become the only visual reminder of their complete family that survived the flames. But on that Saturday morning, photos were safely tucked in albums, and the house felt like the beginning of everything good instead of the end of everything they owned. Noah had awakened early, partly from habit and partly from excitement. The first full day in their new home stretched ahead with the promise of small discoveries and settling rituals. He'd made coffee in the unfamiliar kitchen, testing cabinet doors and learning which ones stuck, memorizing the sounds of pipes and floorboards that would become the soundtrack of their daily lives. Emma had been the first child awake, padding into the kitchen in pajamas decorated with dancing unicorns, her hair a sleep-tousled mess that would require significant negotiation before church. She'd climbed onto a kitchen chair that wobbled slightly, another item for Noah's growing list of small repairs, and announced that she'd dreamed about living in a castle where every room had a different color and princesses could sing as loudly as they wanted. "This is like a castle," she'd declared, spinning around with her arms outstretched. "It has creaky floors just like in fairy tales, and my room has a window where I can watch for dragons." Marcus had emerged 20 minutes later, already dressed, but with his shirt inside out, and his hair defying gravity in 3 different directions. He'd surveyed the kitchen with the serious expression he'd inherited from his mother, mentally cataloguing the differences between this space and their old apartment. The refrigerator was smaller, but the kitchen was larger. The window above the sink looked out onto a backyard instead of a parking lot. The morning light came from a different angle, requiring adjustment to their familiar breakfast routines. "The electricity sounds funny," he'd observed, tilting his head toward the ceiling where the light fixture hummed with an irregular rhythm. "It goes buzz-buzz, quiet buzz, instead of just buzzing." Noah had made a mental note about the kitchen light while pouring cereal into bowls that seemed tiny in the expanded space. Every apartment they'd lived in had trained them to think small, to move efficiently through cramped spaces, to speak quietly, to avoid disturbing neighbors. The house offered room to spread out, but old habits created invisible boundaries that would take time to expand beyond. Lily had been the last to join them, appearing in the kitchen doorway with her hair already brushed and clothes coordinated with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing family logistics since age 10. She'd surveyed the breakfast scene with satisfaction, noting that Emma was eating without prompting and Marcus hadn't spilled anything on his clean shirt. "The water pressure in the bathroom is really good," she'd reported, "and there's a bathtub instead of just a shower. Emma's going to love taking baths again." After breakfast, the children had scattered to continue their exploration of spaces that belonged to them. Emma had claimed the front porch as her stage, practicing songs for an audience of neighborhood birds and passing cars. Marcus had discovered that the built-in shelves in his room were perfectly sized for his airplane collection, each model positioned to catch morning light, streaming through windows that actually opened properly. Lily had found the laundry room off the kitchen, already planning more efficient systems for managing family clothes washing. Noah had stood in the living room, surrounded by boxes that needed unpacking and furniture that required rearranging, listening to the sounds of his children discovering home ownership. Emma's singing drifted through open windows. Marcus made airplane engine sounds from his bedroom, complete with dramatic crash landings and heroic recoveries. Lily hummed while organizing kitchen supplies, the same unconscious melody Sarah had hummed while cooking dinner. The normalcy of the morning felt almost suspicious after 3 years of crisis management and careful budgeting. No landlord would arrive with complaints about noise. No thin walls would transmit neighbors' arguments or late-night television. No monthly rent payment would hover over every financial decision. The house belonged to them, imperfect but theirs, requiring work but offering stability. At 11:30, Noah had been in the basement, investigating the water heater and trying to understand the maze of pipes that delivered warmth and plumbing throughout the house. The basement smelled like old wood and dampness, but the foundation looked solid and the mechanical systems appeared functional, if outdated. He'd made notes about proper ventilation and wondered about the cost of having everything inspected by professionals who could identify problems before they became emergencies. Upstairs, Emma had moved her singing performance to her bedroom, where acoustics created an echo that made her feel like a real princess in a real castle. Marcus had begun the complex process of arranging his homework space, testing different positions for his desk lamp and calculating optimal lighting for evening study sessions. Lily had been folding clothes in the laundry room, creating organized piles that would make the transition to new bedroom storage more efficient. The first spark occurred at 11:47 a.m., according to the fire department's later investigation. 60-year-old wiring, stressed by the increased electrical load of a family moving in with modern appliances, finally surrendered insulation that had been compromised by decades of temperature fluctuations. The spark jumped between wires inside the wall cavity behind Emma's bedroom, where old newspapers used as insulation provided perfect tinder for flames that would spread with devastating efficiency. Emma noticed the smell first, an acrid scent that didn't belong in a house that smelled like cleaning supplies and fresh starts. She'd stopped singing and sniffed the air, trying to identify the source of something that reminded her of the time Marcus had accidentally touched a hot iron to his school project. "Daddy?" she'd called, but Noah was in the basement and couldn't hear her voice over the sound of the furnace fan that had just kicked on. By 11:49, smoke was beginning to seep through cracks in the wall where paint met baseboard. Emma had gone to find Marcus, padding down the hallway in sock feet that made no sound on hardwood floors that had welcomed 4 generations of families before theirs. "Something smells funny in my room," she'd told her brother, who'd looked up from his airplane arrangement with the same serious expression he brought to all problems requiring analysis. Marcus had followed her back to investigate, his 10-year-old mind already working through logical explanations. Maybe something was burning in the kitchen. Maybe Lily was using a hairdryer. Maybe their father was working on something in the basement that involved tools and heat. But the smell was getting stronger, and now they could see thin wisps of smoke emerging from behind Emma's dresser like grey ghosts escaping from hiding places. "Lily!" Marcus had shouted, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who'd spent 3 years being responsible for family safety during their father's work hours. "Lily, something's wrong." Their older sister had appeared within seconds, still holding a folded towel and wearing the expression of someone accustomed to solving whatever crisis her siblings had discovered. But the growing smell of smoke and the sight of grey wisps becoming visible plumes had sent her into motion with an efficiency that would have made Sarah proud. "Get outside," she'd ordered, grabbing Emma's hand while Marcus ran toward the stairs. "Right now. Don't stop for anything." By 11:51, flames were visible behind the electrical outlet in Emma's room, licking at wooden framework that had dried for 60 years and was eager to burn. The fire moved with the speed of a living thing, following electrical pathways and discovering fuel sources with an intelligence that seemed almost personal in its destructiveness. Noah had heard the shouting from the basement and had taken the stairs 3 at a time, emerging into a kitchen where the smell of smoke was already noticeable, and the sound of his children's voices carried panic that made his chest tight with immediate fear. "What's happening?" he'd called. But Lily was already herding Emma and Marcus toward the front door with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been managing family emergencies since their mother's illness had taught them all to respond quickly to crisis. "Fire in Emma's room," Lily had said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I can see flames behind the wall." Noah had run toward the back of the house, where smoke was now visible in the hallway, and the crackle of flames was audible through Emma's bedroom door. The fire had found the wall cavity and was traveling upward toward the attic, spreading horizontally toward Marcus's room, moving with a hunger that spoke of old wood and perfect conditions. "Everyone outside," he'd shouted, following his children through the front door onto a porch that suddenly felt like the edge of safety. "Mrs. Rodriguez, call 911. Their neighbor had already been reaching for her phone, having noticed smoke beginning to emerge from the roof vents of a house she'd watched this family move into with such hope just 12 hours earlier. From the safety of the front yard, they'd watched flames appear in Emma's bedroom window, then Marcus's window, then begin licking at the roofline, where 60 years of accumulated debris and gutters provided additional fuel for a fire that seemed determined to consume everything Noah had worked to provide. The volunteer fire department would arrive in 8 minutes. The flames would take 4 minutes to spread from the children's bedrooms to the kitchen, destroying Emma's new princess castle and Marcus's carefully arranged airplane collection and Lily's organized piles of family clothes waiting to be put away in bureau drawers. But in that moment, standing on the front lawn watching their new home transform from dream to nightmare, all Noah could think about was how close he'd come to losing his children to his own dream of giving them a better life. The house could be rebuilt or replaced. The children could not. Emma had started crying, not from fear but from the sudden understanding that her princess castle was disappearing behind walls of flame and smoke. Marcus had stood silent, watching his airplane collection become fuel for a fire that didn't distinguish between beloved possessions and ordinary furniture. Lily had wrapped her arms around both younger siblings, becoming a shelter in the same way she'd been sheltering them since their mother's death. Noah had pulled all three children close, feeling the weight of failure settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. 3 years of sacrifice, $13,000 of savings, and the first real home his children had known since Sarah's death, all of it disappearing into smoke and ash, while neighbors gathered to watch a family's dreams burn in broad daylight. Emma's burned teddy bear would become a symbol of everything the fire took and everything it couldn't destroy. The stuffed animal, a birthday gift from Sarah 3 years earlier, had been rescued from the wreckage by Fire Chief Anderson himself, a man who'd seen enough house fires to know that sometimes a child's comfort object mattered more than anything else that could be salvaged. Half of the bear's brown fur was singed black, one arm hung by threads, and the smell of smoke had penetrated deep into its stuffing, but the heart-shaped nose was intact and the button eyes still held their shine. The fire department had arrived with sirens that brought the entire neighborhood running. But by then, flames had already claimed the back half of the house and were working their way toward the front rooms with methodical efficiency. Noah had stood helpless on the lawn, holding his children and watching firefighters attack a blaze that seemed determined to erase every trace of their new beginning. "Is there anyone else inside?" Chief Anderson had shouted, already knowing the answer but trained to ask anyway. "No," Noah had called back, his voice hoarse from smoke he'd inhaled during those crucial moments when he'd tried to assess whether rescue was possible. "Everyone's out." The battle between fire and water had lasted 43 minutes, but the outcome had been decided in the first 10. By the time pressure hoses were connected and ladder trucks positioned, the fire had found the attic space and was feeding on insulation and wooden support beams that had been drying for 6 decades. The roof collapsed inward just as firefighters achieved their first knockdown of visible flames, sending sparks and debris cascading through rooms where children had been playing an hour earlier. Emma had buried her face against Noah's chest when the roof fell, the sound of crashing timbers and shattering glass too much for a 7-year-old mind to process. Marcus had watched with the same analytical expression he brought to airplane crashes in his movies, trying to understand the physics of destruction even as his own possessions disappeared beneath falling debris. Lily had stood with one arm around each sibling, her face set in the expression she'd learned during their mother's illness, accepting terrible things while refusing to let them break her. When the firefighters finally declared the blaze under control, what remained of the house looked like a mouth with broken teeth. The front porch still stood, but the roof above it had partially collapsed. The kitchen walls were intact but blackened, windows blown out from heat that had turned their new home into a furnace. The children's bedrooms were gone entirely, reduced to charred framing and ash that would need to be bulldozed away before any rebuilding could begin. "I'm sorry," Chief Anderson had said, approaching Noah with the kind of gentle directness that came from delivering bad news to families for 30 years. "The structure's a total loss, but your kids are safe, and that's what matters most." The words had felt hollow in the moment, though Noah would later understand their truth. Standing in the ruins of his family's dreams, watching smoke still rising from what had been Emma's princess castle that morning, it was difficult to feel grateful for anything. The ambulance crew had insisted on checking everyone for smoke inhalation, loading the family into the back of a vehicle that smelled like antiseptic and emergency medical supplies. Emma's oxygen levels were slightly low, earning her a portable oxygen mask that made her look like a tiny astronaut. Marcus had minor burns on his hands from touching a doorknob that had been heated by flames on the other side. Lily's lungs were clear, but her voice was hoarse from shouting instructions and breathing smoke-filled air. Noah had refused treatment for himself until the paramedics threatened to involve social services in discussions about responsible parenting. His hands were blistered from briefly touching the metal doorframe when he'd tried to assess whether the children's bedrooms were accessible for rescue. His throat felt raw from inhaling smoke, and his eyes burned with a combination of chemical irritation and tears he refused to shed in front of his children. The emergency room at Millbrook County Hospital had seen house fire victims before, but the sight of a father and three children covered in soot and clutching each other in a waiting room designed for individual patients had drawn attention from staff who recognized trauma that went beyond physical injuries. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a name that made Noah's chest tighten with memories, had examined each child with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood that medical treatment was only part of healing. Emma's oxygen levels normalized after an hour with supplemental breathing support. Marcus's burns were cleaned and dressed with bandages that made him feel like a wounded soldier. Lily's lungs were pronounced clear, though the doctor recommended monitoring for delayed symptoms of smoke inhalation. "Where will you stay tonight?" Dr. Martinez had asked, her question carrying implications that Noah hadn't yet processed. The house was gone. Their belongings were ash. The hotel voucher the Red Cross would eventually provide was still hours away from being processed through bureaucratic systems designed to help but slow to respond. "We'll figure something out," Noah had said, the words carrying more confidence than he felt. 3 children. No clothes except what they'd been wearing, no identification except his wallet, and no clear plan beyond making sure everyone could breathe properly. Pastor Williams from First Methodist had arrived while they were still in the emergency room, having heard about the fire through the informal communication network that connected small-town churches, fire departments, and hospital staff. He'd brought clean clothes donated from the church's emergency supply closet, clothes that were mostly the right sizes and completely the wrong style for children who'd been carefully choosing their own outfits for years. "The church has funds for exactly this kind of situation," Pastor Williams had explained, his calm voice carrying the authority of someone who'd helped families through disasters before. "Temporary housing, meals, whatever you need while insurance gets sorted out." Insurance. The word had hit Noah like cold water, forcing him to remember paperwork he'd signed but not fully understood. Homeowners insurance that covered the structure but might not cover the contents. Deductibles that could eat up what little savings remained after the down payment. Claims processes that would take weeks while his children needed clothes and beds and some sense of normal life. "We don't even know what we need yet," Noah had admitted, looking at his children arranged on hospital chairs like refugees from their own lives. Emma was still wearing the oxygen mask, though she no longer needed it. Marcus was examining his bandaged hands with scientific curiosity. Lily was making lists in her head, the same organizing instinct that had helped the family survive their mother's death, but applied now to a different kind of loss. The Red Cross representative had arrived just before discharge, an efficient woman named Carol, who carried clipboards and knew exactly which questions to ask. Temporary housing at the Millbrook Inn for up to 1 week. Vouchers for immediate clothing purchases. Contact information for social services that could help with longer-term planning. Phone numbers for contractors who specialized in fire damage restoration. "The good news is that house fires generate a lot of community response," Carol had explained, while filling out forms that would convert their disaster into manageable bureaucratic categories. "People see a family lose everything, especially a family with children, and they want to help. The challenge is coordinating all that help into something useful." The Millbrook Inn sat on the outskirts of town, a 2-story building that had seen better decades but maintained clean rooms and working air conditioning. The desk clerk, a middle-aged woman who'd probably graduated high school with Noah's older sister, had recognized the family immediately. "Heard about the fire on the radio," she'd said, handing over key cards with the kind of gentle efficiency that suggested this wasn't her first time housing disaster victims. "Continental breakfast starts at 6, and there's a laundromat next door if you need to wash anything." Room 127 contained 2 double beds, a small table with 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot, where their borrowed pickup truck sat, loaded with nothing except empty moving boxes they'd never gotten around to unpacking. Emma had claimed 1 bed immediately, spreading herself across the polyester comforter like she was making snow angels. Marcus had tested the television remote with the focused attention of someone discovering that familiar technology still worked, even when everything else had changed. Lily had begun calculating how 4 people could live in a space designed for vacation travelers who expected to spend most of their time elsewhere. "It's like camping," Emma had announced, though she'd never been camping and was clearly trying to convince herself that adventure was possible, even in circumstances that felt more like punishment. "Indoor camping," Marcus had agreed, finding the positive spin his sister needed while not quite believing it himself. Noah had sat on the edge of the second bed, surrounded by his children and overwhelmed by the sudden silence that followed crisis. For months, he'd been planning their life in the house on Elm Street. Now he was planning their survival in a hotel room that smelled like industrial cleaning supplies and old carpet. The smoke-damaged teddy bear sat on the bedside table where Chief Anderson had placed it after the hospital visit, its singed fur and hanging arm a reminder that some things could be saved even when everything else was lost. Emma had reached for it tentatively, testing whether her beloved companion still felt familiar despite its burned appearance. "He's hurt," she'd said, cradling the bear with the same gentle care she'd show an injured bird. "But he's still here," Noah had replied, understanding that sometimes being damaged but present was enough to build hope around. That night, 4 people had slept in beds designed for 2, with Emma curled against Noah's side and Marcus sharing space with Lily in an arrangement that would have seemed crowded under normal circumstances, but felt necessary when normal circumstances had just burned to the ground. None of them had slept deeply, but all of them had slept safely, which was more than they'd been certain of 12 hours earlier. Tomorrow would bring insurance adjusters and contractor estimates and the complex process of rebuilding a life from ash and good intentions. But tonight, they were together and breathing easily and holding on to a damaged teddy bear that proved some things could survive even the worst kind of destruction. The hand-drawn thank you card that Emma created for the firefighters would eventually hang on the wall at Station 12 for the next 5 years. A reminder that sometimes the lives you save matter more than the structures you lose. She'd made it on Monday morning using crayons borrowed from the hotel's children's activity basket, her 7-year-old artistic skills producing stick figures in yellow helmets, standing next to a red fire truck with wheels that were perfectly round, despite everything else being slightly crooked. "Thank you for saving my teddy bear," she'd written in letters that wandered across the page like a happy drunk. Some capitals appearing in the middle of words where they didn't belong, but the sentiment clear enough to make grown firefighters tear up when Chief Anderson read it aloud during their morning briefing. Sunday evening's local news broadcast had been the first domino in a series of events that would change everything about how Noah understood community, generosity, and the difference between charity and love. Reporter Jessica Kim from WMTV had arrived at the hotel just as the family was returning from a dinner they couldn't afford at a restaurant that had offered them a free meal after hearing about the fire through the small-town communication network that moved faster than social media. "Mr. Briggs, I'm Jessica Kim from Channel 7 News. I was wondering if we could talk about what happened today and how the community can help your family get back on their feet." The interview had lasted 12 minutes, though only 3 minutes would make it to air during the Sunday evening broadcast. Jessica had asked careful questions about Noah's background, his children's ages, the circumstances that led to buying the house, and the family's immediate needs. Noah had answered honestly, his voice still hoarse from smoke inhalation, and his words careful because he'd never been on television before and wasn't sure what was appropriate to share with strangers. "We're grateful everyone got out safely," he'd said, Emma leaning against his side while Marcus and Lily flanked them like protective bookends. "The house can be rebuilt. My children can't be replaced." The news segment had aired at 6:47 p.m., nestled between a story about the county fair's winning pie contest and a weather forecast that promised clear skies for the week ahead. 3 minutes of television that showed a tired father holding his children outside a hotel. Smoke still visible rising from what had been their home that morning, his voice steady despite circumstances that would have broken many people. By Monday morning, the first anonymous donation had appeared in an account the bank had helped Noah establish for rebuilding funds. $50 from someone who signed their name as a friend and included a note that said, "For the children's new bedrooms." By Monday afternoon, the account had grown to 347 from 8 different donors, most of whom lived within 20 miles of Millbrook and had seen the news story during their Sunday evening routines. The school district had reached out through Councillor Patricia Hayes, a woman who'd been helping children process trauma for 15 years and understood that moving from house to hotel to uncertain future required educational support as well as emotional guidance. She'd arranged for the children to continue attending their regular schools while living at the hotel, organizing transportation and ensuring that teachers understood the family's temporary circumstances. Routine helps with processing traumatic events, Mrs. Hayes had explained during a Monday afternoon meeting in her office, which smelled like vanilla candles and contained enough tissue boxes to supply a small hospital. The more normal things we can keep normal, the easier it is for children to adjust to the abnormal things. Emma had returned to second grade with a backpack borrowed from the church's supply closet and a lunch packed in a brown paper bag instead of the princess lunchbox that had melted in the kitchen fire. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had quietly arranged for extra supplies and made sure Emma felt included in activities that might require materials the family no longer possessed. Marcus had gone back to fourth grade wearing clothes that were close to the right size, but not quite the right style. His burned hands making it difficult to write, but his determination to maintain perfect attendance overriding physical discomfort. His teacher, Miss Rodriguez, had adjusted expectations for handwritten assignments while maintaining the same academic standards that would keep Marcus challenged and engaged. Lily had returned to 8th grade, carrying the weight of family logistics along with her homework, her maturity evident to teachers who recognized that some 13-year-olds carried adult responsibilities without losing their essential childhood spirit. Her guidance counselor had arranged for flexible scheduling that would allow her to attend family meetings with insurance adjusters and contractors without falling behind in her studies. The Red Cross had extended their hotel stay by another week after Carol determined that finding suitable temporary housing for a family of 4 was more complicated than her initial assessment had suggested. Most rental properties in Millbrook were either too expensive for Noah's warehouse salary or too small for a family that needed space to heal from trauma. The good news is that your story is generating response, Carol had reported during their Tuesday morning check-in. Channel 7 has been reposting your interview on their social media, and it's been shared over 300 times. The Community Foundation has received calls from people wanting to help, and the Mayor's office has been fielding inquiries about how people can donate. By Wednesday, the Rebuilding Fund had grown to $1,200, with donations ranging from $5 sent by an elderly woman on a fixed income to $300 from a local business that had lost its own building to fire 10 years earlier. Each donation came with notes that revealed how deeply the story had affected people who understood that anyone could lose everything in the time it took to make a cup of coffee. Saw your family on the news. Lost our house to fire in 2008. Know how hard it is. Hope this helps. The Martinez family. My grandchildren are the same ages as your kids. Can't imagine. Praying for you. Margaret Thompson. House fires are the worst. Community support got us through. Paying it forward. Dave and Linda Chen. The contractors had begun arriving on Thursday. Pickup trucks filled with measuring equipment and clipboards thick with insurance forms. The house on Elm Street looked even worse in daylight, the damage more extensive than initial estimates had suggested. Electrical systems throughout the structure would need complete replacement. Plumbing had been damaged by fire suppression efforts, The roof required rebuilding from the foundation up. "You're looking at 6 months minimum," contractor Bill Martinez had explained, walking Noah through the ruins while children played in the hotel parking lot under Lily's supervision. "Maybe 8 months if we run into complications with permits or materials. The good news is that the foundation is solid and the frame can be saved in the front rooms. 6 to 8 months of hotel living. 6 to 8 months of children sharing beds and doing homework on a table meant for tourist brochures. 6 to 8 months of explaining to everyone who asked why a man who'd saved for 3 years to buy a house was now living like a refugee in his own hometown." The insurance adjuster had been more optimistic about coverage than Noah had expected, but less optimistic about timing. The policy would cover rebuilding costs after the deductible, but reimbursement would come in stages tied to construction milestones. The family would need to fund temporary housing and immediate expenses while waiting for insurance checks that might take weeks to process. "The community response is unusual," adjuster Robert Kim had noted while photographing damage for his report. "Most families don't have fundraising support during the rebuilding process. That's going to make a significant difference in your options." By Friday, the fundraising account had reached 100, and Jessica Kim had called to request a follow-up interview about community response to the family's situation. The second news segment would air Sunday evening, featuring footage of the damaged house, alongside interviews with neighbors and community members who'd been touched by the story of a single father's dream becoming a nightmare. But Friday had also brought the first signs of Noah's internal struggle with accepting help from strangers. 3 years of fierce independence, of working multiple jobs and refusing assistance even when offered, had not prepared him for the vulnerability of needing community support to rebuild his family's life. "I don't want to be a charity case," he'd confided to Pastor Williams during a conversation in the hotel parking lot, Emma's laughter audible from the playground area, where she was teaching other hotel children the songs she'd been practicing in her burned bedroom. "You're not a charity case," Pastor Williams had replied, with the gentle firmness of someone who'd counseled prideful people through difficult circumstances before. "You're a father who saved his children from a house fire and now needs help rebuilding what was lost. There's a difference between needing help and being helpless." The distinction would become important as donations continued growing and community support expanded beyond money into offers of labor, materials, and expertise. Because what was happening in Millbrook wasn't charity in the traditional sense, it was community in the deepest sense. Neighbors helping neighbors, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because they understood that anyone could lose everything, and everyone deserved a chance to rebuild. Emma's thank you card would be delivered to the fire station on Monday morning, along with similar cards from Marcus and Lily, expressing gratitude that went beyond childhood politeness into genuine appreciation for adults who'd risked their safety to save what mattered most. Chief Anderson would frame all 3 cards and hang them where his crew could see them during their daily routines, reminders that their dangerous work mattered not just to the families they saved, but to the children who would grow up knowing that some people chose to run toward danger instead of away from it. And the community response would continue growing, one donation and one volunteer at a time, until what had begun as a news story about a house fire became something larger, a demonstration of what was possible when people decided that helping their neighbors rebuild was more important than minding their own business. The architectural blueprint that would change everything arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a woman who introduced herself as Maria Santos and carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to walking onto construction sites, where she was often the only woman and always had to prove she belonged there. The blueprint itself was a work of art, hand-drawn plans for a 3-bedroom house that incorporated everything the original structure had lacked, while maintaining the charm that had made Noah fall in love with the property in the first place. Modern electrical systems designed to handle contemporary appliances. plumbing that would work efficiently for decades, insulation that would keep heating costs manageable, a kitchen large enough for a family to cook and eat together, bedrooms with built-in storage that would help organize children's belongings. But it was the woman who'd drawn the plans who would prove more transformative than the house she'd designed. Maria Santos had been 34 years old when her husband left her and their 8-year-old daughter for a woman who didn't mind that he spent more money on his motorcycle than on his family's groceries. The divorce had been finalized on a Thursday, and by the following Monday, Maria had enrolled in the community college's construction management program while working evenings at a restaurant that let her bring homework during slow periods. 3 years later, she owned Santos Construction, a company that specialized in residential rebuilding and renovation projects that larger contractors considered too small or too complicated to be profitable. She'd built her reputation by taking on jobs that required creativity as well as craftsmanship, working with families who needed extensive renovation on limited budgets, finding solutions that balanced dreams with financial reality. She'd seen Noah's story on the Sunday evening news and had spent Monday morning driving past the burned house, studying the foundation and frame to understand what could be saved and what would need complete replacement. By Monday afternoon, she'd begun sketching preliminary plans that would transform the fire-damaged structure into something better than it had been before the flames. "I know what it's like to lose everything and have to start over," she'd said, standing in the hotel parking lot where Noah was helping Emma practice riding a bicycle borrowed from the church's emergency supply closet. Different circumstances, but the same feeling of having to rebuild your life from nothing. Noah had studied the blueprint with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read construction documents during his months of house hunting, noting details that revealed professional expertise as well as personal understanding of family life. The kitchen design included counter space where children could do homework while dinner was being prepared. The living room layout would accommodate a television and comfortable seating without feeling cramped. Each bedroom had been designed with specific consideration for the children who would occupy them. Emma's room included a built-in window seat, perfect for reading. Marcus's room had shelving designed for model displays, and Lily's room included a desk area where she could study without disturbing her siblings. "This is more house than we had before," Noah had said, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and concern about costs that a warehouse worker's salary couldn't cover. "The foundation will support it, and the additional square footage isn't that expensive when you're already doing major reconstruction," Maria had explained, her tone matter-of-fact rather than reassuring. "The bigger question is whether you want help building it." The offer had been presented as a business proposition rather than charity, which made it easier for Noah to consider seriously. Santos Construction would manage the rebuild using insurance proceeds plus community donations, with labor costs reduced through volunteer coordination and bulk purchasing of materials. The project would take longer than conventional construction because volunteer schedules were less predictable than professional crews, but the final result would be a house built to last generations rather than decades. "I'd need to interview you," Maria had continued, her slight smile suggesting she understood how absurd it sounded to interview someone for the job of having their house rebuilt. "Make sure you're the kind of client I want to work with. Some people are great at losing houses, but terrible at building them." The interview had taken place that evening in the hotel's small business center, a room equipped with 2 computers and a printer that worked sporadically. Maria had brought a folder containing photos of previous projects, references from families she'd helped rebuild after disasters, and a questionnaire that covered everything from preferred paint colors to long-term financial planning. "Building a house is like raising children," she'd explained, while Emma colored at a nearby table and Marcus worked on homework that required frequent consultations with Lily. "It takes longer than you expect, costs more than you planned, and tests every assumption you have about how families work together. But if you do it right, you end up with something that lasts." The questionnaire had covered practical matters, heating preferences, storage needs, accessibility considerations for aging in place, alongside questions that revealed Maria's understanding of how houses become homes. Did the family cook together or separately? Did children need quiet study spaces, or did they work better with background activity? Were there traditions or routines that required specific spatial arrangements? "My daughter Isabella is 9, Maria had mentioned while reviewing Noah's answers. Single parenting changes how you think about house design. Everything has to work when there's only one adult managing 3 or 4 different schedules. The connection had been immediate and comfortable. 2 single parents who understood the logistics of raising children without partners to share daily decision-making. Maria's ex-husband had been absent even when present, leaving her to handle everything from parent-teacher conferences to midnight emergency room visits. Noah's situation was different: loss rather than abandonment, but the practical challenges were remarkably similar. By Wednesday, the crowdfunding campaign had exploded beyond anything the local news station had expected. Jessica Kim's follow-up story about community response had been picked up by regional news outlets, then shared on social media platforms, where it reached audiences far beyond Millbrook County. The fundraising account had grown to Dalek 15-0, with donations arriving from 12 different states, and comments that revealed how deeply the story resonated with people who understood that anyone could lose everything. This is happening all over the country. Families working hard and losing it all to things beyond their control. Thank you for showing us how communities can help. Portland, Oregon. Lost our home to hurricane damage 5 years ago. Community support made all the difference, praying for your family and sending what we can. Pensacola, Florida. Single father myself. Can't imagine facing this situation. Your children are lucky to have you. Denver, Colorado. The viral attention had brought unexpected complications alongside the generous donations. National news outlets were requesting interviews. Social media influencers were asking to feature the family's story on their platforms. A producer from a reality television show had called about featuring the rebuild as part of a series about community-supported construction projects. "This is getting bigger than I expected," Noah had confided to Maria during their 3rd planning meeting, held at the actual construction site, where she was conducting soil tests and foundation inspections. "I just wanted to rebuild our house. Now people are calling it a movement and asking about book deals." Maria had understood the discomfort that came with unwanted attention. Her own divorce had been gossiped about in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, and she'd learned to protect her privacy while accepting help when it was genuinely offered. "You control how much access people get to your story," she'd said, marking measurement notes on her blueprint, while Emma and Isabella played together in the yard that would soon become a construction zone. "Take the help that makes sense, ignore the rest." The first major volunteer had been Joe Mitchell, a 67-year-old retired firefighter who'd spent 30 years responding to house fires and understood both the practical and emotional challenges of rebuilding after disaster. He'd arrived at the hotel on Thursday morning with a pickup truck full of tools and an offer to coordinate volunteer labor throughout the construction process. "Worked construction before I joined the fire department," Joe had explained, his weathered hands still steady enough for precise measuring and cutting. "Been looking for a project that matters since I retired. This feels like something worth doing." Joe's involvement had legitimized the volunteer aspect of the project in ways that mattered to Noah's sense of independence. This wasn't charity. It was skilled labor, donated by someone who understood construction and chose to contribute his expertise rather than his money. The distinction felt important to a man who'd spent 3 years refusing assistance while working multiple jobs to provide for his children. By Friday, Henderson's Hardware had pledged materials at cost, reducing the construction budget by nearly 30%. Millbrook Lumber had offered to donate all framing materials in exchange for featuring the project in their advertising. The local electrical union had volunteered to handle all wiring installation as a training exercise for apprentice electricians. "This is becoming a community project," Maria had observed during their Friday afternoon planning session, reviewing a volunteer schedule that now included 12 different skilled tradespeople and 23 general laborers. Everyone wants to be part of building something positive. The children had adapted to the attention with the resilience that had carried them through their mother's illness and their father's struggles to rebuild their family life. Emma had appointed herself the official greeter for visitors to the construction site, creating detailed tours that included explanations of where her new Princess Castle room would be located. Marcus had begun documenting the rebuild process with a camera borrowed from the school's media center, creating a photo journal that tracked progress from foundation to final construction. Lily had taken on coordination responsibilities, maintaining schedules for volunteer workers and ensuring that everyone involved had the information they needed to contribute effectively. The architectural blueprint had become a symbol of possibility rather than just a construction document. Maria had designed more than a house. She'd created a plan for how a family could rebuild their life with community support, professional expertise, and the kind of collaborative effort that reminded everyone involved that some things were more important than individual achievement. The blueprint would eventually be framed and hung in the completed house's front hallway, a reminder of how dreams could survive even the worst disasters when good people decided to help translate vision into reality. But during those early planning stages, it served as proof that sometimes losing everything created space for building something better than what had been lost. The charred family Bible that survived the fire would become Maria's first glimpse into the depth of Noah's faith and the strength he'd drawn from sources beyond his own determination. She'd found it while conducting a final inventory of salvageable items from the burned house. Its leather cover blackened and pages smoke-stained but still readable, bookmark ribbons melted but text intact from Genesis through Revelation. Noah's grandmother had given him the Bible on his wedding day, her careful handwriting filling the margins with notes about verses that had carried her through 60 years of marriage, child-rearing, and the kind of quiet struggles that tested faith without making headlines. Sarah had added her own annotations during the difficult months of cancer treatment, marking passages about hope and healing alongside practical observations about raising children with limited resources but unlimited love. My grandmother used to say that God's voice was clearest during the worst storms. Noah had told Maria as they stood in what had been the living room, surrounded by the debris of a life that had been carefully built over years and destroyed in minutes. "I'm still listening for that voice, but mostly I hear silence." Maria had understood the struggle with faith that followed profound loss. Her divorce had shattered her belief in promises that were supposed to last forever, leaving her questioning everything she'd been taught about love, commitment, and divine planning. Rebuilding her faith had been as difficult as rebuilding her life, requiring the same patience and determination that learning construction skills had demanded. The crowdfunding campaign had reached 50,000 by Monday morning, a milestone that transformed the project from ambitious hope into realistic possibility. The donations were arriving from increasingly distant locations, shared through social media networks that connected people who'd never heard of Millbrook County but understood the universal experience of losing everything and needing community support to rebuild. Construction planning had become a daily routine, with Maria and Noah meeting each morning to review progress, coordinate volunteer schedules, and solve problems that arose when dozens of well-meaning people worked together on a complex project. The hotel's business center had become their unofficial office, walls covered with blueprints, volunteer contact lists, and material delivery schedules that grew more complicated as community involvement expanded. Isabella asked if she could help paint Emma's room. Maria had mentioned during their Tuesday morning meeting her daughter's request revealing how deeply the families were becoming connected through the rebuild process. She's very particular about color choices and thinks pink might be too obvious for a princess room. The growing friendship between their daughters had surprised both parents, but Isabella's maturity and Emma's resilience created a natural partnership that benefited both children. Isabella had experience with family upheaval and could offer perspective that helped Emma process trauma. Emma had an optimism that hadn't been dimmed by circumstances, inspiring Isabella to believe that sometimes good things could happen even when life seemed determined to deliver disappointment. Joe Mitchell had assembled a volunteer crew that met every Saturday morning at the construction site, organizing labor around people's work schedules and skill levels. Retired tradespeople worked alongside younger volunteers who brought enthusiasm rather than expertise, creating mentoring relationships that benefited everyone involved while advancing the construction process. Building houses teaches patience, Joe had observed while instructing a group of volunteers on proper foundation preparation techniques. Everything has to be done in the right order, and rushing one step creates problems for every step that follows. The children had found their own roles in the construction process. Emma had become the official quality inspector for child-friendly features, testing the height of light switches and the accessibility of bedroom closets with the serious attention she brought to all important responsibilities. Marcus had appointed himself the project photographer, documenting progress with the same systematic approach he applied to his model airplane collection. Lily had taken charge of volunteer coordination, managing schedules and communications with an efficiency that impressed adults who'd been organizing community projects for decades. The relationship between Noah and Maria had deepened through shared planning sessions and mutual respect for each other's parenting skills, but it remained carefully professional despite the growing personal connection they both felt. Noah's grief for Sarah was still too present to allow romantic feelings, and Maria's caution about trusting men after her divorce created boundaries that protected both of them from complications their children didn't need. But the attraction was becoming impossible to ignore, particularly during moments when their partnership felt effortless and natural. Maria understood Noah's determination to provide for his children without losing his independence. Noah appreciated Maria's competence and her refusal to minimize his capabilities or treat him like a victim who needed rescuing. "You're good at this," Maria had said during a Wednesday afternoon planning session, reviewing his suggestions for kitchen layout modifications that would improve functionality without increasing costs. "You think like someone who actually lives in houses rather than just builds them." The compliment had carried weight because it came from someone whose professional reputation depended on understanding how families used domestic space. Maria's designs worked because she paid attention to the practical rhythms of daily life, how children moved through morning routines, where families gathered for meals and homework, what storage solutions actually got used versus what looked good in design magazines. Thursday had brought the first major setback, the discovery that the property's boundary lines were not exactly where the original survey had indicated. The discrepancy was small, 18 inches on the eastern edge, but significant enough to require additional permits and potentially delay construction while legal issues were resolved. "Property disputes can take months to settle," the county clerk had explained, her tone suggesting she'd delivered similar news to frustrated homeowners many times before. "The good news is that you're only talking about 18 inches. The bad news is that 18 inches can be enough to stop construction until everyone agrees on where the boundaries actually are." The news had felt like a betrayal after weeks of steady progress and growing hope. Noah had spent Thursday evening walking through the hotel parking lot, processing frustration and fear that legal complications might derail everything the community had worked to support. The children had sensed his mood despite his efforts to maintain optimism around them, responding with the careful attention they'd learned during their mother's illness when adult emotions required management and protection. Problems happened during construction, Maria had said during an emergency planning meeting Friday morning, her calm tone suggesting that 18-inch boundary disputes were manageable complications rather than insurmountable obstacles. "We adjust the plans, file the paperwork, and keep moving forward. This isn't a crisis, it's just construction." Her confidence had been reassuring, but the delay had highlighted how dependent the family's future had become on factors beyond their control. Insurance payments, volunteer availability, material delivery schedules, permit approvals, community donations. Every aspect of rebuilding required coordination between multiple parties who had their own priorities and timelines. Friday afternoon had brought better news. The local surveyor had agreed to expedite the boundary resolution as a community service, and the permit office had indicated that construction could continue on the portions of the property that weren't affected by the dispute. The delay would be measured in weeks rather than months, and the volunteer schedule could accommodate the modified timeline without losing momentum. "This is why we have contingency plans," Joe Mitchell had observed while reviewing revised construction schedules. "Every building project encounters unexpected problems. The successful ones are the ones that adapt instead of stopping." The weekend had concluded with a community work day that brought 37 volunteers to the construction site, where foundation work continued despite the permit complications. Children from the neighborhood had joined their parents, turning the work session into an impromptu community gathering where families shared meals and stories while contributing labor to a project that had become bigger than rebuilding one house. Emma and Isabella had organized games for the younger children, creating entertainment that kept everyone engaged while adults focused on construction tasks. Marcus had documented the community workday with photographs that captured both the serious work and the celebration that emerged when neighbors chose to help neighbors. Lily had coordinated food and beverage service with the organizational skills that would serve her well in whatever career she eventually chose. The charred Bible had sat on a makeshift table throughout the workday, its damaged cover and survived contents serving as a reminder that some things endure even the worst disasters. Maria had found herself reading passages that Noah's grandmother had marked, understanding for the first time why faith mattered so much to people who'd experienced loss that tested everything they believed about divine providence and human resilience. By Sunday evening, the foundation work was nearly complete, the permit issues were being resolved, and the community support continued growing in ways that surprised everyone involved. What had begun as a house fire was becoming a demonstration of what was possible when people decided that helping their neighbors mattered more than minding their own business. The original land survey from 1952 would prove to contain information that changed everything about Noah's understanding of his property, his fire, and the responsibilities that come with home ownership. Maria had requested the historical survey as part of resolving the boundary dispute, expecting to find routine documentation about property lines and easements. Instead, she'd discovered that the house on Elm Street had been the subject of legal action 3 times in 60 years, each case involving electrical problems that previous owners had known about but failed to disclose to subsequent buyers. The revelation had emerged during a Thursday morning meeting with County Clerk Patricia Hoffman, who'd been researching property records with the methodical attention that had made her indispensable to real estate transactions for 23 years. The 1952 survey included handwritten notes about chronic electrical deficiencies that had caused repeated safety concerns for county inspectors. The 1978 property transfer had included a legal rider requiring the seller to make all necessary electrical upgrades before closing work that had apparently never been completed. The 1995 sale had generated complaints from the buyer about persistent electrical problems that had resulted in a lawsuit eventually settled out of court. "Mr. Briggs," Patricia had said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd delivered unwelcome news to property owners many times before. "It appears that the electrical problems in your house were not only predictable, they were predicted multiple times." The documentation painted a picture of willful negligence that extended far beyond simple ignorance or bad luck. The man who'd sold Noah the house, 73-year-old Robert Harrison, had inherited the property from his father in 1995 and had been dealing with electrical complaints from tenants for almost 30 years. Insurance claims, repair estimates, and county violation notices created a paper trail that any reasonable person would have recognized as evidence of serious safety hazards. He knew, Noah had said, staring at documents that proved his family's nightmare had been entirely preventable. He knew the wiring was dangerous, and he sold us the house anyway. The legal implications were complex and potentially expensive to pursue, but the moral implications were stark and painful to process. Emma's burned teddy bear, Marcus's singed hands, the family's 3 months of hotel living, the community fundraising campaign, the children's trauma, all of it could have been avoided if Robert Harrison had been honest about problems he'd been aware of for decades. Maria had been present during the document review, her professional experience helping her understand both the construction implications and the legal ramifications of deliberate non-disclosure. Properties with known safety hazards carried higher liability for sellers, particularly when families with children were involved, and particularly when the hazards resulted in injuries or property loss. "This changes everything about the rebuild," she'd said, reviewing notes about electrical problems that dated back to Emma's birth year. "If the seller knew about electrical deficiencies and failed to disclose them, you have grounds for recovering costs that insurance didn't cover. But pursuing legal action would require resources that Noah didn't possess: attorney fees, court costs, expert witness testimony, and the kind of extended legal battle that could drag on for years, while his children needed stability rather than continued uncertainty. The moral victory of holding Robert Harrison accountable would come at a practical cost that might outweigh any financial recovery." The news had broken just as construction momentum was reaching its peak. Foundation work was complete, framing materials had been delivered, and volunteer schedules were coordinated for the next 2 months of intensive building. The crowdfunding campaign had reached 67.0, with donations continuing to arrive from supporters who'd been following the rebuild through social media updates and local news coverage. "Do we tell people?" Noah had asked Maria during a private conversation in the hotel parking lot. Watching Emma teach Isabella complex hopscotch patterns, while Marcus and several neighborhood children constructed elaborate obstacle courses using traffic cones borrowed from the construction site. "Do we explain that this whole thing could have been prevented if one old man had been honest about electrical problems?" The question touched on fundamental issues about community support, personal responsibility, and the difference between being a victim of circumstances versus being a victim of someone else's deliberate choices. The fundraising campaign had been built around the narrative of a hard-working father losing everything to an unforeseeable disaster. Learning that the disaster had been entirely foreseeable changed the story in ways that might affect continued community support. Maria had understood the dilemma from her own experience with divorce proceedings that had revealed her ex-husband's financial deceptions. Truth was important, but timing and context mattered when other people's generosity was involved. "People donated to help your family rebuild after a house fire," she'd said, her practical approach cutting through emotional complexity to focus on what actually mattered. Finding out that someone else was responsible for causing the fire doesn't change the fact that your family needs help rebuilding. The broader implications were more troubling than the immediate legal questions. If Robert Harrison had been concealing electrical problems for 30 years, how many other properties in Millbrook County carried similar undisclosed hazards? How many other families were living with dangerous wiring that previous owners had chosen to hide rather than repair? Jessica Kim from Channel 7 had requested an interview about the discovery, recognizing that the story had evolved from inspiring community response to potential investigative journalism about real estate fraud and safety violations. The news segment could bring additional attention to Noah's family, but it might also focus public anger on legal questions rather than construction progress. "I want to finish building the house before we worry about punishing the person who burned down the last one," Noah had decided after consulting with Pastor Williams and considering how extended legal proceedings might affect his children's emotional recovery. "Justice can wait. My kids can't." The decision had reflected the same prioritization that had guided every choice Noah had made since Sarah's death. Children's immediate needs took precedence over adult desires for fairness or accountability. Pursuing legal action against Robert Harrison might eventually result in financial compensation, but it would definitely result in months of depositions, court appearances, and media attention that would prolong his family's status as public figures rather than private citizens rebuilding their lives. Construction had continued through the weekend despite the legal revelations, with volunteer crews focusing on framing work that was both physically demanding and emotionally satisfying. Watching wooden structures rise from the foundation provided tangible evidence of progress that legal proceedings couldn't match. Emma had been particularly excited about seeing the frame for her new bedroom, claiming that the wooden studs looked like the skeleton of a princess castle, waiting for walls and paint to bring it to life. The property survey from 1952 had revealed other information that would prove significant for the rebuild. The original house had been constructed with materials and techniques that were considered advanced for their time, but were inadequate by contemporary standards. The electrical problems were just one aspect of a broader pattern of deferred maintenance and incomplete upgrades that had accumulated over 6 decades of ownership by people who'd prioritized immediate affordability over long-term safety. "This house has been a problem waiting to happen for my entire adult life," Joe Mitchell had observed while reviewing construction documents that revealed the scope of necessary improvements. "Your family just happened to be the ones living there when everything finally gave out." The perspective was both reassuring and sobering. Noah hadn't failed to protect his family. He'd been betrayed by someone who'd sold him a known fire hazard disguised as a family home. But the betrayal didn't diminish the trauma his children had experienced, or the months of instability that had followed their loss. By Monday morning, Noah had made peace with the knowledge that would always complicate his understanding of the fire. Robert Harrison had committed fraud by concealing known electrical hazards, but pursuing legal accountability would require resources and attention that Noah preferred to invest in building his family's future rather than prosecuting their past. The decision to focus on construction rather than litigation would prove wise in ways that extended beyond legal strategy. Community support continued growing because people could see tangible progress toward rebuilding a family's life. Maria's relationship with Noah continued developing because they were creating something together rather than fighting someone else's battles. The children's healing process continued advancing because their daily routine involved watching their new home take shape rather than sitting in lawyers' offices reviewing evidence of someone else's negligence. The 1952 survey would eventually be filed away with other historical documents that explained how problems developed over time but didn't change what needed to be done to solve them. Sometimes the most important justice was the justice that families created for themselves by refusing to let other people's failures define their future. Sarah's handwritten letter had been tucked inside Maria's construction folder for 3 weeks before either of them discovered it. Wedged between electrical diagrams and permit applications where it had apparently been placed by someone who understood that timing mattered when it came to messages about love, loss, and the courage required to build a future that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. The letter had been written during Sarah's final weeks, when cancer treatments had failed, but her clarity about what mattered most had never been sharper. Her handwriting was shakier than in earlier notes found throughout the burned house, but her message was unambiguous in its wisdom and love. "My dearest Noah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're trying to figure out how to be both mother and father to our beautiful children. I know you well enough to know that you're probably feeling guilty about something, maybe about not saving me, maybe about not providing enough, maybe about not being perfect at a job that nobody can do perfectly. But here's what I need you to understand. Loving me doesn't mean you can never love anyone else. Taking care of our children doesn't mean you have to do it alone forever. I want you to find someone who makes you laugh again. Someone who understands that Emma needs extra patience, that Marcus thinks too much about everything, and that Lily tries to take care of everyone because she's afraid of losing more people she loves. Don't you dare spend the rest of your life being a memorial to our marriage. Be a father who shows our children that love doesn't end when life gets complicated, that families can grow in ways that honor what came before while building something new. When you find her, and you will find her, because you're too good a man to stay alone forever, don't waste time feeling guilty about moving forward. I'll be cheering you on from wherever I am, grateful that our children have another person who loves them, and someone who can love their father the way he deserves to be loved. Build a beautiful life, Noah, for all of us." Maria had found the letter on a Tuesday morning while organizing construction documents in her trailer, and had read it with tears streaming down her face as she understood that Sarah had somehow known this moment would come when her widowed husband would need permission to love again and guidance about how to honor the past while embracing the future. The timing was particularly significant because Noah had been struggling with exactly the guilt and confusion that Sarah had anticipated. His feelings for Maria had deepened beyond professional respect into genuine affection and attraction. But every moment of happiness felt like betrayal of the woman who'd given him 3 beautiful children and fought cancer with grace until her final breath. She knew, Maria had said that evening, sitting across from Noah in the hotel restaurant where they'd begun meeting for dinner while the children did homework together in the adjacent dining room. Somehow, she knew you'd need to hear this. The letter had addressed fears that Noah hadn't been able to articulate even to himself. Was loving Maria a betrayal of Sarah's memory? Would pursuing a relationship confuse the children or make them feel like their mother was being replaced? Could a man who'd failed to save his wife be trusted to protect someone else's heart? Sarah's words had provided answers written with the clarity that comes from facing death and choosing to use limited time for what matters most. Love wasn't finite. Families could grow. Moving forward wasn't betrayal, it was life continuing the way life was meant to continue, with people caring for each other and building happiness from whatever materials were available. The legal team that had volunteered to pursue Robert Harrison had been making progress on documenting fraud and negligence, but the process was revealing the complexity of holding someone accountable for decades of deferred maintenance and deliberate concealment. Harrison's attorney was arguing that statute of limitations issues protected his client from liability for problems that had existed for 30 years. The insurance companies were claiming that Harrison's failure to disclose known hazards voided coverage for damages. The county was reviewing whether building code violations warranted criminal charges. Legal proceedings could take 2 years. Attorney Sarah Chen had explained during a Thursday afternoon meeting in her office, which overlooked the construction site, where volunteers were installing roofing materials with the efficiency of people who'd been working together for months. "We're confident about the fraud claims, but recovering damages will require proving specific financial harm that goes beyond what insurance and community donations have already covered." The practical question was whether pursuing legal action would benefit Noah's family or simply provide satisfaction that came at the cost of time and emotional energy that could be better invested in other priorities. Harrison was 73 years old with limited assets. Even a successful lawsuit might not yield significant financial recovery, while the process would definitely require months of depositions, court appearances, and media attention that would prolong the family's public profile. Community support had reached unexpected levels as news of the rebuild spread through social media networks and national news outlets. The crowdfunding campaign had exceeded 85,000, with donations arriving from 42 states and 6 other countries. Volunteer labor had expanded to include skilled tradespeople who were traveling from neighboring counties to contribute expertise to a project that had become a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they decided to help, rather than just observe. But the attention was also bringing complications that Noah hadn't anticipated. Reality television producers were offering substantial payments for exclusive access to the family's story. Publishers were suggesting book deals about community response to disaster. Social media influencers were requesting partnership opportunities that could provide ongoing income in exchange for continued documentation of the rebuild process. This is becoming bigger than rebuilding a house. Noah had confided to Pastor Williams during one of their regular counseling sessions, held in the church office that smelled like coffee and contained enough tissues to handle whatever emotional processing was necessary. People are treating us like symbols instead of just a family that lost their home. The children had been adapting to their temporary celebrity status with varying degrees of comfort. Emma enjoyed the attention and had appointed herself the official spokesperson for the rebuild project, giving interviews to visiting reporters with the confidence of someone who'd never met a stranger. Marcus preferred staying behind the scenes, but had begun documenting the construction process with photography skills that impressed adults who understood the value of visual storytelling. Lily had taken on media coordination responsibilities, managing interview requests, and ensuring that her family's privacy was protected even as their story continued reaching larger audiences. Maria's role in the project had evolved beyond contractor into something more complex and personally significant. Her professional reputation was benefiting from association with a high-profile rebuild that demonstrated her company's capabilities and community commitment. But her personal relationship with Noah was developing in ways that went far beyond business partnership, creating emotional connections that both enriched and complicated the construction process. Isabella asked if you're going to be her new daddy. Maria had mentioned during a Friday evening planning session her daughter's question, revealing how children process adult relationships with the directness that adults often lack. I told her that some questions are too important to answer quickly. The house itself was taking shape with remarkable speed, considering that most of the labor was being donated by volunteers who were learning construction skills while contributing to the project. The foundation was solid. The framing was complete, and the roof was providing weather protection for interior work that would continue through the winter months. Emma's bedroom was beginning to look like the princess castle she'd dreamed of, with built-in window seats and storage solutions that would organize her belongings while providing space for the dramatic play that 7-year-old girls require. Marcus's room included the model airplane display areas he'd specifically requested, with lighting designed to showcase his collection and workspace for the detailed assembly projects that captured his attention for hours. Lily's room incorporated study areas and organizational systems that would support her academic achievements while providing privacy for the social connections that mattered increasingly to 13-year-old social development. The approaching completion of construction was creating both excitement and anxiety for a family that had been living in temporary circumstances for months. Hotel life had forced them to live with minimal possessions and simplified routines, but it had also protected them from the complex decisions that homeownership required. Moving into the new house would mean choosing paint colors, arranging furniture, establishing new daily routines, and transitioning from temporary residents to permanent community members. Are you ready to stop being the family that lost their house and start being the family that built a new one? Maria had asked during their final major planning meeting, her question acknowledging that identity changes often lag behind circumstantial changes. The legal battle, the media attention, the community support, and the personal relationships had all been building toward a resolution that would determine not just where the family lived, but how they understood their place in a community that had embraced them during their most vulnerable period. The house was nearly complete, but the more important construction, the rebuilding of a family's sense of security and belonging, was still in progress. Sarah's letter had provided the permission Noah needed to love again. But acting on that permission would require courage that went beyond the bravery he'd shown when running into a burning building to save his children. Building a future with Maria meant trusting that happiness was possible even after devastating loss, that families could expand without betraying what came before, and that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory was to live fully rather than just survive carefully. The countdown to move-in day had begun, bringing with it the promise of stability and the challenge of learning how to be a family in a house that had been built not just with insurance money and donated materials, but with the hopes and labor of an entire community that invested in their success. The judge's gavel would determine whether Robert Harrison would face consequences for decades of fraud and negligence, but more importantly, it would establish legal precedent about the responsibilities that come with selling homes to families who trust that basic safety disclosures are honest and complete. Judge Margaret Foster had been presiding over property disputes for 18 years, long enough to recognize when cases involved more than monetary damages and legal technicalities. The courtroom was unusually full for a Tuesday morning hearing, with community members who'd been following Noah's story, joining family members, attorneys, and media representatives who understood that the outcome would affect how real estate transactions were conducted throughout the county. Noah sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing the one good suit he'd managed to replace since the fire, flanked by attorney Sarah Chen and paralegal David Kim, who'd been working on the case pro bono as their contribution to a community effort that had already demonstrated what people could accomplish when they decided to help rather than just observe. Robert Harrison occupied the defendant's table with his attorney, Marcus Webb, a man whose reputation for defending difficult cases had been built on finding legal technicalities that protected clients from the consequences of their poor decisions. Harrison looked older than his 73 years, his face carrying the weight of someone who'd spent months being portrayed in local media as the villain in a story about community resilience and family determination. "Mr. Briggs," Judge Foster began, her voice carrying the authority that comes from making decisions that affect families' futures. "Please tell the court about your experience purchasing the property at 1247 Elm Street. Noah's testimony had been rehearsed during multiple preparation sessions, but sitting in the witness stand with his children visible in the gallery behind him brought emotional weight that no practice session could have anticipated. Emma was holding the smoke-damaged teddy bear that had become a symbol of survival and resilience. Marcus had brought his camera to document this final chapter of their legal journey. Lily sat between Maria and Isabella, her mature expression reflecting understanding that this hearing would determine whether their family's suffering had been preventable. "I saved for 3 years to buy that house," Noah said, his voice steady despite the circumstances that had brought him to court. $13,000 that represented every sacrifice my family made, missed meals, patched clothes, no vacations, no extras. We thought we were buying a home where my children could grow up safely. The documentation of electrical problems dating back to 1952 was entered as evidence, each report and complaint creating a paper trail that proved Harrison's knowledge of hazards he'd chosen to conceal rather than repair. County inspection records showed repeated violations for electrical deficiencies. Insurance claims revealed a pattern of problems that any responsible homeowner would have recognized as evidence of serious safety concerns. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Foster addressed the defendant directly, "you inherited this property in 1995 and were aware of electrical problems that had generated complaints for 30 years. Why did you not disclose these known hazards to Mr. Briggs during the sale process?" Harrison's answer revealed the reasoning that had justified 3 decades of negligent property management. The electrical problems were intermittent and not immediately dangerous. The previous tenants had been overly cautious about minor issues. The house had passed inspection, even though the inspections had noted deficiencies that required attention. "With respect, Your Honor," Harrison said, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who'd convinced himself that legal compliance was more important than moral responsibility. "I followed all required disclosure procedures. The buyer had the opportunity to conduct his own inspections." The defense strategy was technically sound but morally questionable, argue that legal minimums were sufficient even when common decency would have demanded more complete honesty about known hazards that could endanger families with children. Maria's testimony provided professional context about the electrical problems and their predictable consequences. As a licensed contractor who'd inspected the fire damage, she could explain how 60-year-old wiring under modern electrical loads created conditions that made fires inevitable rather than just possible. This wasn't a case of old wiring finally wearing out. Maria explained to the court, her professional credentials lending weight to technical testimony that non-experts might have difficulty understanding. This was a case of known deficiencies being ignored until they became dangerous, then hidden from buyers who had the right to make informed decisions about risk. The children's presence in the courtroom served as a powerful reminder that real estate fraud affected real families rather than just abstract legal principles. Emma's burned teddy bear and Marcus's bandaged hands provided visual evidence of consequences that went beyond financial damages into trauma that would affect their development for years. Fire Chief Anderson testified about the investigation that had revealed the fire's cause and the preventable nature of the electrical failure. His 30 years of experience with house fires gave him authority to explain why this particular fire could have been avoided with proper electrical maintenance that any competent property owner would have recognized as necessary. "In my professional opinion," Chief Anderson told the court, "this fire was the direct result of known electrical hazards that had been documented for decades. The wiring conditions that caused this fire didn't develop overnight. They'd been getting worse for 30 years, while Mr. Harrison chose to ignore professional recommendations for repair." The prosecution's case was methodical and compelling. Harrison had known about electrical problems, had received professional advice about necessary repairs, had chosen to ignore safety recommendations for financial reasons, and had deliberately concealed known hazards from buyers who trusted his honesty during disclosure procedures. Harrison's defense centered on technical compliance with minimum legal requirements rather than moral obligations to protect families from preventable disasters. His attorney argued that property sales involved buyer beware responsibilities and that Noah should have conducted more thorough inspections before purchasing a 60-year-old house. But Judge Foster's questions revealed skepticism about defense arguments that prioritized legal technicalities over common decency. Her experience with property disputes had taught her to recognize when sellers were trying to escape responsibility for problems they'd created through years of negligent maintenance and deliberate concealment. The hearing stretched through the morning as both sides presented evidence and testimony that would determine not just financial damages, but legal precedent about disclosure responsibilities in real estate transactions involving known safety hazards. The new house deed that Judge Foster signed that afternoon would represent more than legal ownership. It would symbolize a community's commitment to ensuring that families who worked hard and played by the rules could trust that basic honesty would protect them from preventable disasters. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, Judge Foster announced, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that had taken 3 hours of deliberation. This court finds that Mr. Harrison engaged in fraudulent concealment of known safety hazards, violated disclosure requirements under state real estate law, and bears legal responsibility for damages resulting from his willful negligence. The courtroom erupted in applause from community members who'd been following the case for months, but Judge Foster's gavel quickly restored order as she continued with the specific terms of her ruling. Mr. Harrison is hereby ordered to pay full restitution for all costs not covered by insurance, including temporary housing expenses, replacement of personal property, and construction costs exceeding the original property value. Additionally, this court awards punitive damages of $50,000 to reflect the serious nature of fraudulent concealment that endangered the lives of 3 children. The financial award would total nearly $90,000, effectively covering every expense the family had incurred since the fire, while providing additional funds for the children's future education. But more important than the monetary judgment was the legal precedent that would protect other families from similar fraud, and the validation that Noah's trust in basic human honesty had not been misplaced. It had been betrayed by someone who chose deception over decency. Noah felt tears he'd been holding back for months as he understood that his children's suffering had not been inevitable, that his 3 years of sacrifice had not been wasted on a house that was destined to burn, and that the community support they'd received had been supplementing rather than replacing justice that was rightfully theirs. "Mr. Briggs," Judge Foster addressed him directly as the courtroom began to empty, "I want you to understand that this ruling reflects not just legal liability, but moral accountability. Mr. Harrison's actions were inexcusable, and this court's decision should provide some measure of justice for the trauma your family has endured." The victory celebration was immediate but subdued, held in the courthouse hallway, where Maria wrapped Noah in an embrace that carried months of shared worry and mutual support. The children clustered around their father with the relief of people who'd finally received confirmation that their suffering had been recognized and their rights had been protected. "Does this mean we won?" Emma asked, clutching her smoke-damaged teddy bear and looking between the adults who were wiping away tears and smiling simultaneously. "It means that the person who should have told us the truth about the dangerous wiring has to pay for what happened when he didn't," Noah explained, kneeling to Emma's eye level and speaking with the same careful honesty he'd used to explain their mother's death and the reasons they'd had to leave their apartment. "It means that what happened to us was wrong, and now it's been made right." Marcus had been documenting the courthouse scene with the systematic attention he brought to all important events, creating a photographic record of the moment when their family's legal battle reached its conclusion. His bandaged hands had healed completely, but the camera he carried had become a tool for processing experiences that were too complex for 10-year-old emotions to handle without some form of creative expression. Lily's reaction was characteristically mature and practical. "So, we can finish building the house without worrying about money?" she asked, her question reflecting the financial anxiety that had shadowed every aspect of their rebuild planning despite community donations and insurance coverage. "We can finish building the house and know that we'll never have to worry about this particular problem again," Noah confirmed, understanding that his 13-year-old daughter had been carrying adult concerns about family security since their mother's illness had taught her that bad things could happen to good people without warning or reason. The legal victory had come just 2 weeks before the planned move-in date for their rebuilt home, providing closure that would allow the family to begin their new life without the shadow of unresolved injustice hanging over their fresh start. Construction was 90% complete, with only final inspections and minor finishing touches remaining before the house would be ready for occupancy. Media attention following the court decision was extensive, but generally positive, focusing on themes of justice, served and community support, validated rather than dwelling on the trauma and loss that had precipitated the legal battle. Jessica Kim's follow-up story would air that evening, featuring interviews with Judge Foster about the precedent set by the ruling and with community members who'd contributed to the rebuild effort. This case demonstrates what's possible when communities decide to support families in crisis while also holding accountable the people whose negligence created the crisis in the first place. Judge Foster told the television reporter, her comments reflecting understanding that legal proceedings could serve broader purposes than just resolving individual disputes. The afternoon following the court decision was spent at the construction site, where volunteer crews were applying final coats of paint to interior walls and installing fixtures that would transform the wooden frame into a fully functional family home. Emma's bedroom was nearly complete, with built-in window seats and princess-themed decorative elements that exceeded her 7-year-old imagination of what a castle room should contain. Marcus's room included the model airplane display areas he'd specifically requested, with lighting designed to showcase his collection and workspace for the detailed assembly projects that captured his attention for hours. The room felt larger than their previous house had offered, providing space for the kind of focused hobby work that Marcus used to process emotions and maintain the sense of control that helped him manage anxiety about changes in family circumstances. Lily's room incorporated study areas and organizational systems that would support her academic achievements while providing privacy for the social connections that mattered increasingly to 13-year-old development. The room included a reading nook where she could escape family chaos when necessary, and desk space where she could maintain the careful academic planning that would support her long-term educational goals. The house itself represented collaboration between professional construction expertise and community volunteer labor, with Maria's design vision realized through the contributions of dozens of people who'd chosen to invest their time and skills in rebuilding a family's stability. Every room reflected both practical functionality and emotional understanding of how families use domestic space to create security and belonging. "This is more than we ever had before," Noah observed while walking through rooms that were nearly ready for furniture and family life, his voice carrying gratitude that extended beyond the physical structure to encompass the relationships and community connections that had made rebuilding possible. Maria's response reflected her own understanding of how the project had changed her life, as well as Noah's family's circumstances. "Sometimes, losing everything creates space for building something better than what was lost," she said, her words acknowledging that the house fire had initiated changes that affected everyone involved in the rebuild process. The legal victory had provided closure that would allow them to move forward without the burden of unresolved injustice, but more importantly, it had validated the community support that had carried them through months of temporary living and uncertain future. The court decision proved that their trust in neighbors and strangers had been well placed, that justice was possible even when it required months of patience and legal persistence, and that sometimes the worst things that happened created opportunities for the best things to emerge. That evening, the family had dinner in the hotel restaurant for what would be the last time, their familiar corner table serving as the setting for reflection on a journey that had transformed their understanding of community, resilience, and the difference between losing everything and losing what mattered most. "Tomorrow we move home," Noah said, raising his water glass in a toast that included Maria and Isabella, who'd become family through shared construction work and mutual support during the most difficult period any of them had experienced. The toast was echoed by 4 other voices, each representing someone whose life had been changed by the decision to help rebuild rather than just observe and sympathize from a safe distance. The brass house number plaque that read 1247 had been installed on the front door that morning, its polished surface reflecting sunlight that streamed through trees that had witnessed 4 generations of families calling this address home. Emma had insisted on being the first person to touch the numbers, her small fingers tracing each digit with the reverence of someone who understood that numbers on a door meant belonging somewhere that couldn't be taken away by circumstances beyond their control. 6 months had passed since the court victory, and the house had become more than shelter. It had evolved into the center of a life that balanced honoring the past with embracing a future that none of them could have imagined during those first desperate hours in the hotel parking lot, watching their dreams disappear into smoke and ash. The community celebration had been Maria's idea, a housewarming party that would thank everyone who'd contributed labor, materials, expertise, or emotional support during the 10 months between fire and completion. The guest list included volunteer construction workers, donors from the crowdfunding campaign, neighbors who'd provided meals and encouragement, and the firefighters who'd saved Emma's teddy bear and the children's lives. "This house belongs to all of us," Maria had said while planning the celebration, her words reflecting understanding that community investment created community ownership in ways that went beyond legal property rights. Everyone who helped build it deserves to see how their work turned out. The party had begun at noon with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that featured Emma wielding scissors that were comically large for her 7-year-old hands, while Marcus documented the moment with photography skills that had improved dramatically during his months of chronicling the rebuild process. Lily had prepared remarks that thanked specific volunteers by name, her speech demonstrating the public speaking confidence she'd developed through months of coordinating community support efforts. Fire Chief Anderson had been given the honor of saying the first words inside the completed house, his presence symbolizing the connection between destruction and rebuilding that had defined the family's journey. "Some houses are built with nails and lumber," he'd said, standing in a living room that buzzed with conversation from 50 people who'd chosen to invest in strangers' happiness. This house was built with love and determination and the kind of community spirit that makes small towns worth preserving. The house itself was a testament to what became possible when professional expertise combined with volunteer enthusiasm and unlimited community goodwill. Emma's bedroom had become the princess castle she'd dreamed of, complete with built-in window seats where she could read stories and watch for the dragons that lived in her imagination. Marcus's room showcased his model airplane collection with lighting that made each plane appear to be frozen in flight, while providing workspace for the increasingly sophisticated building projects that captured his focus for hours. Lily's room included study areas and organizational systems that supported her academic achievements while offering privacy for the friendships that had become central to her 13-year-old social development. The kitchen had become the heart of family life that Sarah had always envisioned, with counter space where children could do homework while dinner preparations created the background sounds of domestic security. The living room accommodated both quiet family evenings and the larger gatherings that had become part of their social routine since Maria and Isabella had become permanent fixtures in their daily lives. Noah and Maria's relationship had progressed with the deliberate pace of two people who understood that blending families required patience, communication, and respect for children who'd already experienced enough disruption to last several lifetimes. The wedding had been planned for the following spring, a ceremony that would take place in the backyard, where volunteer workers had planted gardens and built the gazebo that would frame their vows. Sarah would have loved Maria. Lily had observed during one of their family dinners, her comment reflecting the mature perspective she'd developed about love, loss, and the ways families could grow without betraying what came before. She would have liked that we found someone who makes Dad laugh again and doesn't try to replace Mom, but just adds to what we already have. The foundation they'd established to help other families facing housing crises had processed its first grant applications, using the surplus funds from community donations and the legal settlement to provide emergency housing assistance for families whose circumstances echoed their own experiences with unexpected disaster and financial vulnerability. "We received help when we needed it most," Noah had explained during the foundation's first board meeting, held in the church basement where Pastor Williams had provided space for the organization that grew from their personal experience with community generosity. Now we have the opportunity to provide that same help to other families who are facing the same kind of crisis we survived. The foundation's first recipients were a young couple whose apartment had been destroyed by flooding and an elderly man whose mobile home had been damaged by storm winds that had left him homeless at 74 years old. Both families were receiving temporary housing assistance and construction support that followed the model developed during Noah's rebuild. Professional management combined with volunteer labor and community fundraising that transformed individual disasters into community-building projects. Isabella had adapted to her role as Emma's older sister with the grace of a 9-year-old who understood that families could expand in ways that benefited everyone involved. Her friendship with Emma had evolved into the kind of sibling relationship that enriched both girls' daily experiences while providing Maria and Noah with evidence that their developing partnership was creating positive outcomes for all 4 children involved. Marcus had begun teaching Isabella about model airplane construction, sharing his expertise with the patient instruction that reflected his growing confidence in his own knowledge and abilities. The relationship had helped him develop leadership skills while providing Isabella with a brother who could explain how things worked and why details mattered in both airplane assembly and life planning. Lily had embraced her role as the family's oldest child with characteristic maturity, helping Isabella navigate the social complexities of middle school while maintaining her own academic excellence and social relationships. Her ability to balance family responsibilities with personal development had impressed teachers and counselors who recognized exceptional emotional intelligence in someone who was still technically a child herself. The evening celebration had concluded with speeches that thanked specific volunteers, a slideshow that documented the construction process from foundation to completion, and the presentation of framed photographs to everyone who'd contributed significant time or resources to the rebuild effort. But the most meaningful moment had come when Emma had stood on the front porch, where she'd first announced that the house looked like a princess castle. Holding the same smoke-damaged teddy bear that had survived the fire and symbolized their family's resilience through months of uncertainty and temporary living arrangements. "This is our home," she'd said to the gathered crowd, her 7-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned that home wasn't just a place, but a feeling of safety that could survive even the worst disasters if the right people decided to help rebuild what had been lost. The crowd had responded with applause that acknowledged not just the completion of a construction project, but the demonstration of what communities could accomplish when they decided that helping neighbors mattered more than minding their own business. As the last guests departed and the family settled into their first evening as permanent residents of the house that had been built from ash and community goodwill, Noah stood in the living room that smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings, surrounded by children who were finally home and embraced by a woman who'd helped them rebuild more than just walls and windows. The brass numbers on the front door would weather many seasons and welcome many visitors, but they would always mark the address where a family had learned that sometimes losing everything created space for building something better than what had been lost, where community support had proved stronger than individual disaster, and where love had demonstrated its capacity to grow rather than just endure. Home. Noah understood, while listening to his children's voices echo through rooms that belonged to them completely and permanently, wasn't just the place where you lived. It was the place where people chose to help you build the life you deserved. One volunteer shift and one generous donation and one act of neighborly kindness at a time.